And good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for coming out to our seminar on dealing with cravings. My name is Kevin Richardson. I'm the founder of Naturally Intense. I'd like to start by introducing you to my absolutely stellar team, starting with our senior personal trainer, Erica Citron.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to talking with everybody.
And Tiffany Menges, our Naturally Intense personal trainer.
Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. Thanks for joining us today. This is going to be really exciting.
And we are going to do this seminar the way we normally do seminars. So anyone who has been tuning into the seminars that we've been doing, it's really important for me that when we do a seminar, it's not simply us talking. If it's just us talking, it becomes a little bit too academic and not really interactive and not really personalized. And there's so many questions that people have. I think it's really important that we find the time to try to get as many questions in as possible. So what we're going to do, I'll be talking about the topic, and I want you all to chime in with any questions that you have. Now you can ask questions at any point in time, put them in the chat. And from there, both Erica and Tiffany will see the questions, and then they'll bring your questions and present as many of them as possible when we get towards the later part of the seminar. That way we can really have a chance to get through as much questions as you have and do the best we can in terms of trying to make sure that you get the most out of these seminars. So starting with the topic itself, cravings. I've been a personal trainer now for 30 years. 2021 marks my 30th year as a personal trainer and nutritionist. And one of the biggest problems that we have just in general is the fact that so many of us trying to get into better shape, trying to lose weight, trying to follow a proper diet, struggle with food cravings. And it's not something that anyone is immune to. Every single one of us at some point in time, whether we like it or not, has to deal with, you're trying to eat a certain way, but your body, it feels like your body and your mind wants you to eat a totally different way. And some people will feel almost hijacked by their foods. They'll feel like no matter how hard they try, there's this one thing that once they start eating it, they can't stop, and they eat and they eat and they eat and they feel out of control. And it's that sense of out of control that I want to really address today, because it's a real problem. It's a real problem. And I think it's something that the more we understand why it is the way it is, the better equipped we will be to deal with it, the better equipped we will be to get around it. Now, there's two approaches. The first approach is to talk, from a science perspective and, go into the whole endogenous opioid neurotransmitters, HPA axes and such. And we're going to do a little bit of that, but we're going to also talk a little bit more about from an anecdotal point of view. I think that one of the things that I like to do as much as I can is take the experience that I've gained and been really, privileged to gain from working with so many people from so many different places over the past 30 years and kind of share their experiences and my experiences. And I'm also going to invite Erica and Tiffany to share some of their experiences as well in terms of what they've done to be able to get through and some of the struggles that we've all had to go through as well, because it's important to just start with the idea that we all have this as a problem. We all have this as something that we struggle with. It doesn't go away. You don't get to a point where you don't have cravings anymore. You get to a point where you can control it better. You get to a point where you're in a position where you feel like the cravings are more background noise than something in the foreground that you can't, take your attention off of, but it's always going to be there. And we're going to talk a little bit about why cravings are and how important they are and the role that they serve, because they do serve a particular purpose. And we're also going to talk about the fact that if you do have cravings, and you are feeling hopeless and you are feeling that there are foods that you just really and truly cannot stop eating, that the first thing before anything else is it's not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing that you did wrong. There's not a matter of you have a lack of willpower. It's not a matter of some people are stronger than you are and they can, tough it through and be able to have an iron will and keep on going no matter what. It has nothing to do with that. Some of the issues are genetic. Some of the issues are behavioral. Most of the issues are environmental. And some of the issues are simply a matter of we're all human and we all deal with it and we all deal with it differently. So it's important not to beat yourself up if you find yourself, if you're looking at this right now and either you or someone you know is struggling with food and you feel, and I think the word food addiction is one that people tend to, use a lot more commonly now than before. And it's actually a pretty accurate description. It is to some degree a bit of an addiction. And in some cases, there's nothing wrong with that because those very same processes are what kept us alive, what got us to where we are, what got us to the 21st century. Human beings wouldn't exist if these particular cravings that we are struggling with now in this environment, were not the way they are. They're very much important. The problem is that we no longer live in the environment that we are predominantly adapted to. And that's really the problem. It's more a matter of an evolutionary discord between where we are and where our bodies were designed to be. And because there's a gap between those two, you're always going to have a little bit of problems. There are pluses and minuses to both of them. And one of the struggles of 21st century life is trying to figure out how to balance those pluses and minuses in a way where we still are able to be healthy, maintain a sustainable, healthy lifestyle in the face of an environment that isn't necessarily healthy in very many cases, in many ways. Now, we talk about, food, and I'll use the word food addiction as a war. There's the war on drugs that people talk about all the time. I like to think about the idea of a war on food, bad food, unhealthy food, the foods that you probably shouldn't be eating, the foods that you shouldn't be eating, the foods that you feel terrible when you eat them afterwards, but you find yourself uncontrollably eating them nonetheless. And in keeping with that war theme, Sun Tzu's The Art of War is one of the predominant treatises for strategy, military strategy. And it's kind of applicable to this particular scenario as well. And the first precept of it, is that you have to know your enemy and know yourself. And I think because we are so much bombarded by marketing that tells us how things should be for you to buy stuff, that we tend to not be that knowledgeable of why we are the way we are and why it is that we're responding the way we are. And marketing in of itself is unfortunately the way most people get their education when it comes to nutrition. Most nutrition that I've heard people talk about isn't so much nutrition, it's more or less marketing that was sent in that direction with the idea of making them buy something, make them eat a certain way, make them do something that's profitable for another party. Not so much a matter of this is just biology outside of, the selling or promotion of any product or individual or service. So we talk a little bit about what it is to be human and how we became human, how we survived for all this time. And what we have as cravings is one of those really important parts of what got us here. And the way it got us here is through something that's called the reward system. So in not just human beings, but all mammals, and in fact, to some degree, all animals have some variation of a reward system. In that if we do an activity that benefits us in terms of our survival, our ability to reproduce, and our ability to maintain the existence of our species and our own individual lives, our bodies adapt in a way whereas those particular behaviors are accentuated. And we get some degree of let's say a reward per se, which we experience as a feeling of well-being, which we experience as a feeling of kind of like everything is in flow, everything is good, a sense of peace, a sense of calm. And that comes from the secretion of what are called endogenous opioids. Now, endogenous opioids are exactly the same as the opioids that we know and talk about all the time with the drug crisis that we have going on. It's not that difficult to talk or to understand the difficulties people have with coming off of, opioid addiction. But it's important that we put into context the fact that endogenous opioids that our bodies create, which is predominantly dopamine and serotonin, have pretty much the same effect and the same addictive ability. But that idea of addiction being a bad thing isn't really how it works, because those particular addictive behaviors that result from the secretion of high levels of endogenous opioids are what, like I said, kept us alive. And I'll give you an example. So early humans, or any one of our ancestors who eventually would go on to become human, they all had different responses to different foods. So the ones who were eating foods that were high in sugar were the ones who would be more likely to look for foods that are higher in sugar. Foods that are high in sugar are, things like fruits, that, and the other, and would have been very much advantages for their survival over those who didn't. So any pre-human animal that didn't really have a predisposition towards anything sweet would have died out a long time ago. The ones that survived were the ones who were able to develop this particular affinity for sweet things. Really simple, not too hard at all. And they would have died out pretty quickly, because if you think about what milk is responsible for the ability of any young mammal to grow. Without the absence of the mother's milk, all infants would die. Now, we're not talking about in the 20th century when baby formula was invented. For thousands of years before that, any animal had to be sustained by its mother's milk or by the milk of another mammal of the same species, preferably, which makes it such that that baby had to have an ingrown ability to gravitate towards something that was high in sugar and high in fat, and also high to some degree in a little bit of salt. And all those things are found in breast milk. And the suckling response that we all had when we were babies that made us kind of instinctively know and want to keep on drinking breast milk is what kept us alive. You drink the breast milk. After drinking the breast milk, it would activate what's called the HPA axis. The HPA axis will release a certain number of neurotransmitters called dopamine, like I said, and serotonin, which makes you feel good, makes you feel warm, comfortable, cozy inside, that feeling of peace. And when those neurotransmitters start diminishing, the longer you go from drinking the breast milk, you start going through, let's not say withdrawal, but you start feeling no longer that feeling of well-being, no longer that feeling of satisfaction, no longer that feeling of peace and calm. And so you want more of it. And that's what's called the reward system. That's how the reward system loop goes. And so the baby at some point will say, I want more breast milk, because it's not just a matter of nutritionally sustaining me, but it also makes me feel good. The same applies to our foods. When we eat foods that are high in fat, when we eat foods that are high in salt, when we eat foods that are high in sugar, it activates the same axis that makes us secrete those same neurotransmitters that make us feel good. Now, that's really, really important, because we kind of take it for granted that in an energy-rich environment where there's so much food, you can go to the supermarket, you can go online, order food, go to a restaurant, that we forget that in an environment where we don't have the trappings of civilization, it's really difficult to figure out what you should and should not eat. Now, we have marketing that pretty much tells us what to eat all the time, which is, sometimes can be good, sometimes, and most times can be bad, unfortunately. Mostly is bad, most of the time. Most of the times these days, unfortunately, in places here like the United States, where it's more a matter of capitalism than the common good when it comes to food information, nutritional information. But our ability to figure out what we should and should not eat comes directly from the reward system. There are certain foods that will help us survive, and those particular foods are the ones that when we eat them, we have that response, that reward loop going on saying, I want some more of it. It felt really good eating that food. I want to have some more of that. Whereas the foods that didn't help us survive, you wouldn't feel the same way. Like, oh, I'm good. I don't want that much more of that. I'm good. Don't want any more. And that's really, in a nutshell, how it works. Now, the problem is, like I said before, these are the same mechanisms that someone who is struggling with an opioid addiction goes through, in that you take an opioid and you have this, truly immense amount of neurotransmitters going into your body that make you feel really, 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 really good. And then when it goes away, you want to have that experience again. You want to have it happening all over again. And the more you use it, the more your brain, which is pretty much a malleable organ, if you can call it that, it becomes used to the idea of having that level of neurotransmitters flowing through it, even though it's not endogenous, made from our bodies, it's external in the form of a drug, a pill, or an injection. So your body gets used to it. And it's the same thing that happens as well with foods. Now, before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, all the foods that we ate were not powerful enough to create a really tremendous neurotransmitter response. It didn't, light up your HPA axis the way that cocaine would. If we think about fruits, for example, fruits are perhaps the sweetest thing in nature that you can find besides honey. And whenever someone talks about honey being a natural source of sugars, I always remind them that finding honey in nature is exceptionally rare. It was only when humans were able to start kind of cultivating the whole art of beekeeping and such, which happened, hundreds of thousands of years after, we already became what we became, that the sweetest thing you could probably find in nature was a fruit. And the fruits that we eat today have all been very carefully and meticulously genetically modified to be as sweet as possible, because we like sweet things. The sweeter the fruit is, the more we like it, the more we eat it. So when we create a fruit and we find that if I put this one with that one, it gets a little sweeter, we keep on doing that. So all the fruits that we have today are almost unrecognizable, not just in terms of size from their original counterparts, but also in terms of their sweetness level. The sweetest thing you'll ever find in nature is probably about as sweet as a carrot. And most people kind of, hear that and they think, well, that can't be how it is. And that's actually how it is. Our bodies are pretty much tuned to not having that much sugar coming in. That's the ancestral environment that our bodies came from. Now, our bodies are always adapting, they're always changing. And we also, as human beings, because we have our brains that are, sometimes advantageously bigger than those that of other animals, we have free will that allows us to do things that can adapt our behavior outside of actually physical adaptations. We can choose to do certain things and choose to not do certain things. And one of the problems was with the Industrial Revolution, number one, even those fruits today are much sweeter than they were and they would be in a natural environment where humans didn't intervene, they still don't have enough of an impact on your HPA axis to make your brain go, completely crazy and say, I need to have more, I need to have more, I need to have more. No one ever ate an orange or an apple and felt like they had to wake up in the middle of the night to go have some apples and oranges. It just doesn't happen. It's not that powerful. Also because of course there's fiber there, and the fiber will blunt how quickly the sugars get into the bloodstream. The problem with the Industrial Revolution was that we started processing our foods, and it was a good idea. The processing of foods was not some evil plan to try to make everyone fat, obese, and out of shape. It was in response to a growing population and trying to figure out, how do we feed all these people? What can we do? And the way to do that was to start processing food, trying to make the most of what you have. It wasn't necessarily, bad scientifically. It was really well-meaning, but like many things that are well-meaning, sometimes doesn't always end up with a good result as far as our bodies are concerned. Because again, we're adapted to eating fruits, vegetables as pretty much the sweetest things we'll ever come across. And as far as our fat levels, the fattest thing that we'd probably eat would have come from animals that were either wild, which is really low in fat, or domesticated. And grass-fed domesticated animals aren't really that high in fat. They really, really aren't. In fact, most of the grass-fed animals that we see in the supermarkets that tend to have those layers of fat in them tend to be fed non-grass products a couple of months before they're harvested, so they get fatter. Naturally, however, we don't really come across that under normal circumstances. So we're not really designed to have too much fat coming into our bodies at the same time either. And we're not designed to have too much sugar coming into our bodies at the same time either, because we're not designed for that. That's not what we grew up. That's not what our species, let's say, grew up in. It's not the environment we're from. So once we're exposed to that, it becomes a problem. Salt is the third problem. And the thing about salt is, because our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, they didn't need any excess salt, but they did need to have some reward system reaction that would tell their bodies that you need to take in some degree of sodium. Now, by eating strictly a diet of meat, human beings are able to get a little bit over the recommended amount of sodium, daily sodium intake for the day. It's not that hard. You can easily get well over 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium just from eating meat alone, getting enough that you would need to sustain the amount of calories you'd probably require. That being said, humans didn't really need to seek sodium, but we have that inert need and requirement within us, and also that HPA response if we change our diets. So somewhere around 5,000 years ago, this is way past the Neolithic era, we're going into the beginning of agriculture, we started refining salt and using salt in our diets. And the problem is that, yes, we do need daily intake of sodium, but sodium does, unfortunately, affect the limbic system, which does, again, produce the neurotransmitter and the reward system loop that we were talking about before. It happens with sugar and fat. Now, fast forward to today. Food manufacturers are very much aware of how our body responds, and also aware that because our brains are malleable, if you are flooded with foods that activate all of those particular axes, if your foods has sugar, salt, and fat, for example, you kind of don't have much that you can do. There's not really much you can do. A lot of us will feel almost like our bodies are hijacked by those foods. Like you can't stop eating it, you can't stop thinking about it. And it's not, again, because of willpower. It's simply because your brain is being, flooding itself with, dopamine and serotonin as a response to these particular foods. And unfortunately, the more your body's flooded with those particular chemicals, the more your body gets used to having that level of chemicals. just like a drug addict who takes cocaine or someone who uses opioids, and they get this particular level of external, chemicals in their body, your body always tries to go towards homeostasis, which is a balance. And you're kind of resetting that balance where the balance is having more than it naturally should have. And it's going to make you, as a result, seek out those foods more. It's going to make you feel like you want to get those foods more. And it's going to feel almost uncontrollable. And because the foods we have today are nothing like the foods that we had before, we can't self-regulate because we're not designed to self-regulate. And I think it's important that we say this. Human beings are not designed to self-regulate. Everything that we do here, everything I'm telling you here, are things we had to learn along the way in response to our new environment. And you have to think about eating healthy and trying to be healthy as trying to adapt to an environment that we're not really adapted to. And so if you can make any inroads in doing so, understand just how much of the odds that you're up against. It's not an easy thing to do. It's hard. It's very, very hard. It's like taking I always use the example, take a parrot from the Amazon, put it in New York City. It's going to have a very difficult time trying to stay alive based on the food it has available to it and the stress it's going to have to deal with, because the environment that it was designed to be in is not the environment it's in anymore. But it is possible. There are things that we can do. There are ways to go around food cravings. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those techniques before we go into the Q&A section and talk a little bit about our experiences. And I think the most important thing to understand is that there is a genetic component. Some people have really, really, really high responses to certain foods. Some people don't. Those are the ones who have easier time, drinking soda and stopping drinking soda. Whereas some people can drink soda and they can't stop drinking soda. Some people can have ice cream and have no problem stopping ice cream. Others really struggle with it. That's genetic. That's really a matter of how your genes are and how your brain responds based on certain chemicals. Then there's the aspect of behavior as well. Some of us naturally have behaviors and we've taught ourselves behaviors, or we're maybe born with behaviors that allow us to kind of, not work along the idea of immediate gratification. Walter Mischel was a very noted behavioral psychologist who did this really important study, groundbreaking study on what he called the marshmallow experiment. And it's relevant to us because it's also one of the key ways that you would use and employ in trying to deal with having cravings that you can't control. And for the marshmallow experiment, what Professor Mitchell wanted to do was try to see, not so much with adults who were pretty much, let's say, contaminated with their experiences and with so many different cultural aspects that could influence their decision making. He wanted to work with kids to see how they would respond to what's called a hot stimulus and their ability to resist it. And so what he did, he took some marshmallows, full of marshmallows, and put just about 400 kids one by one in a room by themselves with the marshmallows and said, listen, here's a bell. If you can wait until, here's a bell, you can ring the bell at any point in time, eat the marshmallow, no problem. You can have more marshmallows if you can wait for 15 minutes and not eat the bowl of marshmallows in front of you. Now, for a preschooler, 15 minutes of not eating marshmallows directly in front of you would pretty much be, some form of torture and a real hell, I could imagine, for them. But what they found was that a third of them were able to spend the whole 15 minutes and not eat the marshmallows, just a third. But the average child, within 30 seconds, couldn't resist and started eating marshmallows. Now, that might sound that there's a third of us who are just genetically somehow, able to deal with, the idea of eating something that we crave better than others, and then that's the end of the story. But what was interesting from Professor Mitchell's findings was that the children who didn't eat the marshmallows all did the same thing. They distracted themselves. They put their hands in front of their eyes, they sang songs, they looked away, they'd pretend the marshmallow was something else. They distracted themselves, and by distracting themselves, they were able to deal with the hot stimulus of seeing something that they really and truly wanted to eat it. They were able to self-regulate. They were able to do that. And when Professor Mitchell taught the other kids who only lasted 30 seconds how to do that, the ones who learned it were all able as well to spend 15 minutes with the same stimulus and control themselves. Preschoolers. Now, what does that have to do with us? It has everything to do with us. It says that it's not a predestined genetic thing. It's something that we can get better with practice. And the best way that you can deal with the stimulus of food is to practice distracting yourself. Now, unlike drugs, it's a little bit easier because it does go away. If you really and truly want to eat something and you tell yourself, I'm not going to think about not having it, because that's actually a way of thinking about it. I'm going to think about something else or do something else. What's going to happen is that you're going to forget about it. Your mind's going to go on to something else. And in most cases, that sense of needing like really uncontrolled, I need to go, I need to have it right now, is going to pass. Now, the other thing that bears mentioning about our environment is that human beings, everything that we ate for most of our time on the planet, although for some people in the planet right now, getting food itself also requires activity. But for the most part, we had to work to get our food. Either to grow the food, hunt the food, gather the food, harvest the food. Some physical activity was required for us to eat. So that activity also creates a reward system loop. When we do activity, it releases and activates the HPA axis and also releases those same neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine, same ones you get from food, same ones you get from, using drugs that could be addictive as well. Because our bodies need to be active. Our bodies are designed to be in an environment where we're active, because as far as our bodies are concerned, it doesn't know that you can go to the fridge and get food. It's already there. It feels it needs to be primed in such a way that it can always have to be ready to run, walk, bend, lift, or do whatever it has to do to get food. There has to be some activity involved in there. Now, there's only so much endogenous opioids our body can secrete at any one point in time. And we can think about the way it comes across with exercise, and people talk about like the runner's high. People who run talk about the point where they feel completely at ease. That's the HPA axis being activated. That's your body being flooded with those neurotransmitters. People who lift weights talk about that point where you really feel like you're training really, really, really hard and everything is excruciatingly painful. Then all of a sudden you're in this moment of like almost complete bliss. That's the same, it's exactly the same thing. That's what it is. Now, because endogenous opioids is something that our body has to secrete and produce, there's a limited supply of it. So what studies have found, and what we know anecdotally from just in general, the more active you are, the more your body's already secreting all these neurotransmitters. So it doesn't have as much to secrete if you eat something that you shouldn't. For example, if you have a piece of chocolate, for example, the response of someone who exercised not that long ago versus somebody who doesn't exercise at all is going to be different. One has tons of neurotransmitters just waiting to pop out there, whereas the other person kind of used some of them already with the exercise and can feel sated and can feel a sense of, balance and well-being from exercise alone. And that's why exercise is a really, really, really important component to it as well. So the two things which are simple, which is cognitive exercises to remove yourself, completely remove yourself, mentally remove yourself, because sometimes you physically can't. Drugs can go away. I worked with people who had substance misuse for 17 years in social services. That was really something I did for a very, very long period of time. And we always talk about people, places, and things. But with food, you can't get away from it. It's always going to be there. There are always going to be people who are going to have, tempt you to eat the wrong foods. There will be places you go to where you're going to be encountering the wrong foods, and the foods are always going to be there. So it's something that we have to really focus on doing internally, and the way to do that is to kind of mentally distract ourselves. So that's really the key issue and the key strategies that I use whenever I felt like I was going to eat something I didn't want to eat. I would think about something else. I'd go train, I'd go for a walk, I'd go dance, I'd go practice martial arts. I had millions of things that I would do. And what happened over time is the more I kept on practicing doing that, the less I found I had to do it. To the point now where I do get food cravings, but it's background noise. It's like someone really, really far away whispering, and I can barely hear them whispering. Whereas I remember when I was younger, it felt like someone was right there next to me shouting at me from the inside. So I think it bears noting that it's not something that happens overnight. It takes years and years and years of practice. It's a path. It's something that you have to explore, and you're going to fail at it. You're going to fail miserably. You're going to fall on your face. You're going to feel horrible, but you should never feel horrible, because all you need to do is get back up and realize that it's a hard thing to do. Don't ever think that fitness personality who looks so fantastic and has the ideal body doesn't have the same issues that you do, because we all do. We all suffer from it. We all have to struggle through it. And what's important is that we don't stop. Idea of say that's like a crack addict. If someone was addicted to crack, you would not tell them that you can have small amounts of crack over time and that'll be much better and that'll help you get rid of your addiction. You wouldn't tell them that, because that would be absurd. But it's the same thing. The foods that we're eating today are what are called hyper palatable foods. And hyper palatable foods are foods that are designed to overwhelm your senses, to create that strong HPA axis response, to create that flood of neurotransmitters, make you feel good, activate the reward system, and then it'll make you buy some more of it. That's the way food marketing is. And there's no getting around it. In terms of people trying to find a middle ground, there is no middle ground. I wish there was a middle ground. I always talk about, if I had a magic wand and one wish, my wish would be people could eat certain junk foods, certain processed foods, and not have a problem. But understand how powerful it is. Let's just take the least addictive of all the three. There's sugar, fat, and salt. Salt is perhaps the least addictive. And the HPA axis activation that we have from eating salty foods are so powerful that studies have found that the majority of people who are diagnosed with hypertension, a condition where a high sodium intake is going to almost guarantee an early demise, are unable to stop eating salty foods. That's salty foods alone. We go into something like sugary foods, like sodas, drinks, the coffees and all the lattes and the stuff that people get that are so popular these days. And people, for some reason, have this perspective that because it's, not McDonald's, somehow better than, regular junk food, but it's exactly the same. They think that somehow or the other that, ingesting and having this huge response to a particular food, that it'll be controllable. It's not controllable. You can't control it. You can't have it in moderation, because it's going to change the way your brain patterns are. It changes your brain. I think I was cut off when I was saying this, but it bears repeating if you didn't hear me the first time, that back in my time, when I was younger, which was not long ago, food corporations would have people in a room and do a focus group. So everyone would have a taste of whatever the food was, and they'd say, well, how did that taste? And they'd say, oh, well, tasted okay. How did that one taste for you? It tasted okay. And what they found was several interesting things. They found that as the generations went by, people needed more and more sugar to really feel that it was really, really good or really, really sweet. So our perception of things like sweet are also malleable as well, because the more exposed we are to it, the more used and accustomed we are to it. We evolve with the foods that we ate, millions of years ago. And unfortunately, we continue to evolve to some degree with the foods we're eating today, but in a negative way, because those foods are not ones that our bodies can adapt and safely ingest without having any, bad side effects. Now, fast forward to today, they don't do focus groups anymore. They give people samples of a particular food. They'll do a CAT scan. They'll see literally on a screen if the HbA axis lights up the way it does in a drug user when that particular food is given at particular doses, how much sugar should be in there, how much fat should be in there, any salt in there, whatever else, that and the other. And they create their formulas based on science, the science of addiction. So if you think logically that an addict or someone who's addicted to something can control their behavior, that's not really the case. Now, there are some people out there who can, and again, having worked with substance abuse populations for all those years, I can tell you, there actually are people out there who can take crack and cocaine and moderate it and be fine. Those people do exist, but they're not everybody. And the ones who do have problems have serious problems. And thus the idea is it's best not to try it, because if you try it, you never know whether or not you'll be one of those who can moderate it. But very, very few can moderate. Very, very, very few. And it's just generally just not a good idea. And again, going back to the fitness people talking about moderation, a lot of them look really, really great, but be careful, because a lot of them are very, really young. I hate to say this. It's easy to have a six-pack and look great when you're young. It's easy. Most of it's genetics for most people. If you are somebody who is looking to someone who genetically is in fantastic shape since pretty much all their life, that might not be the person to get dietary advice from. If you're looking at someone who is either worked with people who are in bad shape, who are not naturally at all in great shape, but were able to get them into great shape. If you work with people who themselves were not naturally, fantastic looking, but they had to work and struggle for years to get there, they're the ones you want to listen to. And what's more important, especially in this particular time and era, the young people are not the experts on what you should and should not eat and how you should and should not eat. They're also not the experts, the ones who use drugs. A lot of people on social media use drugs. I can tell you it for a fact, not because out of conjecture, because I know them. I grew up with them. I grew up alongside them. I've worked alongside them. People use drugs, eat whatever the hell they want, post on social media saying, hey, look at me eating a pizza. Look at me drinking a beer. You can have some too and look like me. Well, no, you can't unless you use the drugs that they're using. But they tend to be a little bit, let's say, forgetful in mentioning the fact that they're using drugs, because again, it's all about the prestige. It's all about trying to present a particular way of feeling that you can connect with your audience. And I wish there was a way that I could say that most people out there could eat junk food in moderation and be fine, but unfortunately, that's unfortunately just not the case. So what I want to hear a little bit from Tiffany in terms of, and then you too, Erica, what's it been like for you all? Because both Tiffany and Erica are examples of people who had to start changing the diet, who had to start eating differently. And, I'm not going to say it, I'll let them put it into their own words, but I want to hear what they had to say about what it was like.
I talked about this a little bit the first time that you disconnected. But yes, I'm definitely fall under the category of the people that you were describing, where sugar tends to be one of the harder things to cut off. from. For me, that was definitely one. And actually, someone in the Q&A, one of our attendees mentioned something along the lines of that people on social media, maybe it's not just that they're wanting to promote like perfect eating is bad, or that, but they also take into account the social aspect and cultural aspect of food, and that they'd rather that maybe these people would rather have 90% of the people eat like less than perfect and only a small minority eat perfectly, but at least it's something. I can attest to being one of those people that would try to like eat 90% perfectly and the 10% not perfectly, getting in that a little bit of sugar here, there, and that whatever the case is. For me, it was chocolate, like you said, one of the examples you gave. And it just created me wanting that craving more. Honestly, that was my, instead when you genuinely cut something off, that craving tends to go away. For example, this is kind of very on topic but off topic. Like I quit drinking soda when I was a child, simply because I was like, oh, I'm gonna just not drink it for a little bit, and then I have never drank soda again, ever. I gave it up. I gave it up for religious reasons, like for Lent. But then after 40 days, I literally didn't want soda anymore. It's like, it's one of those things that it's so crazy when you can find that way of distracting yourself, finding something else to do, something, a health, like an actual healthy alternative to this food substance that you're loving. It really can create you not having that craving, rather than 90% on, 10% off. That 10% off over time, we talk about this as something that we say 10% off over time equals 100% off. 10% off 10 days later equals 100% off. And it sounds harsh and it sounds kind of crazy, but it is possible. And that's why I really do promote that. Also, just for the whole point of when I came into Naturally Intense, being an example has been such a big part of being a part of this organization, is being an example to our clients. As if we're promoting a certain lifestyle, we need to live it as well. So being able to do that has been a really big like mental and rewiring of the brain. One question like I did want to just bring in, speaking of like rewiring the brain, I've never heard of this program. Have you heard of the program Noom, by the way, Kevin? Is that a good program? I don't know anything as far as.
I think it's difficult to say if it's a good program or not. I always say this:
Programs like that.
the jury is out on any particular program unless it's been around for 10, 15 years. People have been doing it for 10, 15 years successfully. Anything less than that, as far as I'm concerned, as an old timer, it's still unproven. It's still, let's see. They have some really good, from what I've heard with some of the people who I've spoken to about it, it does focus a lot on cognitive behavior changes, which is always positive and always a positive thing. But is it something that's sustainable in the long term? Just like everything else, like I've seen so many diets come and go, so many programs come and go, and I've always said the same thing. I'm not going to say yes or no. The answer is, you can tell how good a tree is by the fruit it bears, and for fruit to bear, it takes a couple of years to really see that. So we'll see.
But yeah, that's my personal journey.
No, I think Tiffany answered that really well and beat me to the point of saying, 90% good doesn't really exist. It's kind of one or the other, unfortunately. And I wish it didn't work that way. I wish 90% existed, because if that was the case, I would have been on point for the last 6 years. I would have been killing it. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And one of the biggest things I'll say is I didn't understand what it really meant to be on diet until I did my first bodybuilding competition. That was not when I was a bikini competitor, but when I competed in the bodybuilding category itself, was the first time I actually consistently stuck with everything. And I was like, oh, wow, this is what it feels like. Okay. Now, let's be honest for a second. I did that competition and I fell off again, because it's a trial and error. I'm falling on my face. I continue to fall on my face. But I think it's important, we are an example for our clients, yes, but that doesn't mean we're perfect all the time. It means that we're kind of falling alongside you. And Kevin just said this is his 30th year. He figured it out. So I think it's fair to say, more or less, I think it's fair to say that we have to be okay with failing and figuring it out as well. I'm 6 years in. 6 compared to 30 is still a pretty big gap for even, such a young chap like Kevin. But going into, where I started, and I'm going to answer this question because it's extremely personal and relevant to me about being a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for 10 years. I was a vegetarian when I started bodybuilding. It is more difficult to get protein. Yes. When Kevin first gave me my diet, I was like, why am I eating 3 egg white omelets a day? And that was because I told him I didn't like beans and I didn't like lentils. Well, I love beans and lentils now, but this is a very different Erica. It is more difficult for sure. And my reasoning for being a vegetarian, I was like 8 or 9 years old, I think, when I decided to be a vegetarian. I was very picky with textures with food. Meat, for whatever reason, just started to gross me out, and I didn't want to eat it anymore. I also, of course, care about animals, but I do think it is becoming easier to find sustainable companies and sources to get your meat from, of course. That is a growing market that, hopefully is advertised correctly and remains truly sustainable. And I do hope that those sources do continue to grow. But in terms of getting your protein sources as a vegetarian, you can't just eat vegetables. That's not going to be enough protein. You do have lentils, you do have beans, you do have egg whites. You do want to stay away from dairy. Dairy, of course, is going to be high in protein, but it's also going to be very high in fat, and it also tends to be very high in sugar. And I think Kevin has something he wants to say about that as well. Oh, no, you unmuted yourself. So that would be my quick 2 cents about vegetarianism. I did also make the decision to begin eating meat again. I started with fish and I eat chicken as well. But again, that was a personal decision. If you do want to be a vegetarian and you do want to have enough protein intake and remain healthy, of course, it's possible. Is it going to be more difficult? And are you going to be more limited in your options? 100%, unfortunately. And the protein substitutes, the same way that I talked earlier about the quote unquote health food market, the protein substitutes that you get that are advertised to the vegan and the vegetarian consumers are unfortunately highly processed. They tend to be very, very high in sodium, or like I said, again, other processed materials. And it's just really not ideal to be going into those products. But yeah, so that's my journey, as a vegetarian, and talking about my own successes and failures, and still just figuring it out as we go. And the number one thing we can say is, you guys are not alone. We're also not perfect beings. And I want to really emphasize that we're not advertising perfection. We're not advertising an easy path. We're not advertising instant success either. Rather, we are discussing how to achieve something that is very hard as a human. And that's what we are. We are human, and human error is a part of humanity. As much as we wish it wasn't, it will be, and it always will be. So we did have another question about portion size. As long as we are eating perfectly healthy, is it okay to eat huge portions? So off the bat, I'll say no. We talked about moderation, and moderation still applies even to the healthiest of foods. Too much of a good thing is still going to eventually be a bad thing. So even if, you're eating as per the diet and everything you should be, you still can't have too much of it. Calories are still something to take into account. Fat is still something to take into account. Fat does still exist in healthy foods, and you can only have so much of it. Kevin, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to say. I also talked earlier, about breakfast like a king, lunch like a quartzman, dinner like a pauper. It still exists. If you're having that huge portion size, like I said, before you're going to bed, those are, sleeping calories. It's energy that you're not going to expend, and eventually it's going to add up.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that. The only thing I would add is in terms of huge portions are never a good idea because it depends on what time of day you're having huge portions. If you have a huge serving of anything earlier in the day, it's not going to be the same metabolically in terms of how your body stores fat as having a huge portion later in the day. There is a difference. Food timing is, we don't really have time to get into food timing itself, but it is a factor in how your body stores fat. So if you're trying to lose weight, for example, huge portions are not a good idea. If you're trying to gain weight, then huge portions might be a good idea, but it's very rare these days people are trying to gain weight. The idea is usually weight loss. And I would always advocate, and I've had really good success over the years with people eating smaller portions spread out over the course of the day as far as helping them control their cravings. If you have a steady stream of nutrients coming in, you're less likely to have cravings. The other thing that's important as well, I should add in terms of dealing with cravings, is the idea of fiber. Now, most of the foods we crave tend to be carbohydrates, and the carbohydrates we have from processed foods are very low in fiber, which makes it possible for us to eat a lot of it. You take the fiber out and you can eat a lot. Potato chips, you can have bags and bags of potato chips all day long, keep on eating it. Potatoes, however, you can't. Now, why is it we can't eat that much potatoes, but potato chips can eat so much of it? The reason being is the fiber. The fiber content is a lot higher in potatoes than in potato chips. Now, I think when you think about what can you do cognitively, that's one thing, but there's also things you can do from a physical point of view, which is eat foods and eat carbohydrates that are only high in fiber. If your carbohydrate sources are really high in fiber, you'll naturally not want to eat too much more of it. And you're also less likely to have cravings for carbohydrates because of the fact that you're getting enough. And because as well, that fiber is going to give you also a sense of satiety. It's going to make you feel like I had enough. But if your stomach feels full, and fiber has the effect of making you feel full, it blunts the effect of your wanting to keep on eating more of other things. So I even had one client years ago, and what he would do is that he would take a teaspoon of oatmeal. It was oatmeal back then. We didn't have oat bran cereal the way we do now. And he would take a teaspoon of that whenever he had a food craving, and he would say it would miraculously go away. And I think the reason it went away because he just took in a little bit of fiber. He got some carbs, he got some fiber, and that was enough to kind of blunt everything. What worked as well for a lot of people was a glass of water. Whenever they felt that they had to eat something, it wasn't so much a matter of they wanted to eat something because they were hungry. It was much more the other kind of oral urge. You're used to eating a certain number of times a day, used to snacking, and you're changing your diet. You're not snacking as much as you are. So your body is saying, hey, your brain is saying, sorry, hey, it's time to snack. Put something in your mouth. Well, instead of eating something that's food, you have some water, no calories in water, and it can, in many cases, help you with those cravings as well.
We had another great question. Sorry, Kevin. And I laughed a little bit because we just had this conversation. In terms of the pace at which you eat, slowly versus quickly, how does that affect your hunger? Would you like to take on that one? And I'll just say this discussion came up because I recently had a stomach virus and found that as I was trying to get back into eating regularly again, it took me, I think, almost 45 minutes to an hour for me to finish one meal. Kevin's answer to that was, well, Erica, you're making it harder for yourself to finish eating so slowly. So if you want to go into that just a little bit more, I think it's a great conversation.
Sure. I started off at 125 pounds. And when I started bodybuilding, the whole idea for me was to get as big as possible. And I was the kid who didn't eat very much at all. So I would struggle to finish a full meal. And what one of my coaches told me, which was kind of interesting because it's long before any science or biology, was that if you want to eat a lot, eat fast. And I was like, really? If I want to eat a lot, eat fast. So I tried it. I would go and instead of having my meals, and I'd usually I was a slow eater. I take my time, I'd eat really slowly. And I started eating fast, and all of a sudden I could somehow eat everything. I could get everything down. It wasn't a problem anymore. And as I got older, as I got more experience, as I became a personal trainer and started becoming fascinated with the whole science of how the human body works, I learned that it does make a huge difference. It's a huge difference. Now, our bodies are, again, we all come from an evolutionary background where we sometimes had to gorge. We had to eat as quickly as we could because someone was going to take the food from us or something would take the food from us. Now, we're not really apex predators in a natural environment. Take away the guns, we kind of suck compared to most predators. And early man, who was in the very early stages of building tools, versus all the predators that you can imagine in our ancestral environment, very often after, let's say, making a kill, that kill would attract every single predator in the area. So you had to eat as quickly as possible and get the hell out of Dodge, as they would say. So we're evolved to eat a lot of food really, really quickly. If you eat really, really quickly, those signals from your stomach to your brain that says, all right, we're full, that's enough. It takes a while before those particular chemicals can be secreted, which can then tell your brain, okay, that's enough. It takes time. If you eat really fast, you override that time. So by the time your body says, hey, that was enough, we just got the signal, our stomach is full, your stomach was already full, which is why a lot of people who eat fast talk about eating to the point where they feel like their stomach is going to burst. They eat a lot really fast and they feel like they're going to burst. And if you eat slowly, you have enough time for your stomach to naturally tell your brain, okay, we've had enough, so stop. So if you're trying to lose weight, eating slowly is an excellent way of, passively, without that much stress on your part at all, making you eat less.
And then we have another really great question. Really great questions today. Thank you guys. It's exciting. I just lost it really quick. So the environmental considerations and financial considerations seem to be driving what people eat. What is your opinion on financial security affecting eating healthy on a consistent basis? So before we get into the financial, environmental considerations are definitely a thing. And recently we had an issue with the surge in almond butter, right? Almond butter or almond-based products became very, very popular. But what happened was the fields in which the almonds were being cultivated ended up basically getting destroyed, more or less, if I'm not incorrect, Kevin. It created a bit of an environmental issue with the cultivation of almonds because of the water intake and the way that they are harvested in the fields ended up becoming a major problem, and they weren't able to rotate crops properly and basically meet the required output in order to keep creating these products. So when everyone started going over to almond butter, we had quite a bit of a problem with the harvesting. So environmental factors can definitely be important with how you eat. And I think we could definitely do a whole seminar on that, honestly. But I think financial considerations is another important thing to talk about. If Kevin or Tiffany have anything they want to say about that.
Well, I think it's, there's a large number of people on the planet right now who deal with what's called energy scarcity, which is the fact that they are unsure where the next meal is going to come from. Coming from a third world country, coming from having been in so many places, even here in the United States, working with lower income populations and the formerly homeless populations, even here in the United States, there are people who also struggle with energy scarcity in terms of they are unsure that they will have enough to eat, especially, with the COVID-19 pandemic creating so much insecurity in terms of employment for so many people, especially lower income people. The problem when I came to the United States for me straight out was the fact that fast food created a really cheap um, alternative that was hard to beat and hard to argue against. I used to work with populations who were subsisting only on whatever they got based on a very fixed income, based on whatever Social Security or welfare provisions they were getting because of disabilities or because of the fact that they were older. Um, and they didn't have that much money. And the first thing they would always say is that, how do we eat properly? How do we eat, eat organic? How do we eat, in a healthy way when we have such little money? And you can go to McDonald's and for, $1.99 get pretty much enough to sustain your, get a meal. It's really hard to argue against that. But here's the thing, there are ways around it. The good food is not the expensive food. It's just we don't think about what the good food is. We had lost funding for the breakfast program that we had I used to work, I'll just start over. I used to work at a residence for the formerly homeless, and the food supply we had from donations stopped. So we didn't have breakfast for some of the tenants that we had there who really needed that meal first thing in the morning. And what I found was that by getting oatmeal and egg whites and sometimes some fruit, I could make sure every single person who needed breakfast would have it without spending that much money at all. It really didn't cost that much at all. And they loved it, and they kept on doing it. It required some work on our part. And unfortunately, before, the donations that we had were things like bagels and donuts and desserts, not exactly the healthiest of breakfasts, but the healthier breakfasts of just making the oatmeal and making the egg whites. It actually didn't cost that much. And then I decided, okay, let's do some cooking classes. So I had cooking classes where I would teach them how to eat healthy without having to spend that much money. And there are some things that don't cost that much money at all. If you're vegan, beans don't cost very much because they're not sexy, and you can get so much protein out of it and you get carbohydrates out of it. If you're not vegan, things like eggs, unfortunately, become really expensive, but you don't need that much of them. But I think that you have to think it through. You have to kind of think about it. And sometimes compromises are inevitable, especially if you have a family and you're lower income and you're trying to figure out how to feed your kids. And, if you go to the fast food place, there you have a meal for your kids and still have some money left over to help pay your bills. Whereas if you elected to make a healthy meal, it might be a little bit more. But sometimes if you do the math, you can find that the healthy meal might not necessarily cost as much as you think it does. But again, it is a struggle. And that's here in the United States we're talking about. If we juxtapose this to somewhere like a third world country, it's not even an issue. You go with whatever's cheapest. That's really what people do. But I always say this, do your best to try to eat the least processed food possible. And I said, do your best. I don't say eat the least, don't eat, only eat unprocessed foods. It's do your best, because we have to remember some people don't have the privilege sometimes of being able to have that much in terms of choice. That was an excellent question, by the way. And it looks like we're coming to the end. So I want to wrap up with having Erica and Tiffany take a couple more questions, and then we'll really fast answers to some of the questions we had.
Well, we don't have any more questions.
Oh, wow.
We nailed it. Yeah.
Wow, we did it. We finally did it. We did it. We did it right on time. So with that, then, I would like to thank everyone so much for coming out. I really and truly appreciate the ability and the time that we have where we can share our experiences and our expertise. Um, it's one thing to have, Erica mentioned the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years. I've been a personal trainer now for 30 years. And it's one thing to have all this knowledge within you and to be blessed to be in a place where you've learned so much, but it's only worth it if it's shared.
Mhm.
And what I would like to invite all of you listen to this seminar one day when you become a fitness expert, because you will, that you do the same. Just always try to share as much as you can with people around you. When they ask, of course, never unsolicited fitness advice is always a bad thing. And I think that's really what we're about with these seminars, just trying to get the information out there so that, we're not selling anything. We're not trying to get anybody to buy our products. And let me just say as well, I have been offered sponsorship products for supplements, foods,
I talked about this a little bit. Yeah.
countless times over the years, and I always say no, because it's the position that I have with my clients and the position I have with people who look to me and look to all of us for information on diet and exercise. It has to be unbiased. And if I am being paid to promote a particular item, it does affect my credibility and my ability to talk impartially about what is and what isn't. And that's something that here at Naturally Intense we're really, really strong about. That being said, if anybody does want help with their diet, if someone does need personal training, you always feel free to contact us. You can go to naturallyintense.net. There are free trials there, and you can always ask questions as well. We're also on social media as much as we can be. I'm at Naturally Intense on Instagram. Erica is at Erica Citrin on Instagram. Tiffany is at Tiffany Menges on Instagram. And, do feel free to contact us. Do feel free to reach out to us. We will answer questions. I spend a good amount of time every single day answering questions people, from emails I get, from questions on social media. And we're always going to be more than willing to answer them, because every question is an important one, because all of you are important to all of us. And I think if we, have that particular perspective, and keep in mind as well that all the knowledge that I have is thanks to people like you asking me all these questions and trying to find out the answers to them. So it helps all of us grow. It helps all of us get better, because we're all in the same boat. So without going over our time, I'd like to thank everyone again. And I am Kevin Richardson. This has been Erica Citrin and Tiffany Menges. And together we are Naturally Intense Personal Training, wishing you a truly fantastic rest of your day. And thank you so much for tuning in. Bye for now.